I'm excited to be here to be talking about reproducibility, and I want to give you a little bit of orientation to my perspective on reproducibility, which is different than all the other speakers. I am embedded as an ethnographer at the eScience Institute, and the eScience Institute is an organization dedicated to advancing data-intensive discovery across all fields, or sort of the data science center of the University of Washington. And I co-lead a group called the Data Science Studies Working Group that is actually across UC Berkeley and NYU that thinks about things like the ethical, social, organizational dimensions of data science and some of those implications. This is part of a broader funded, Sloan Foundation funded initiative to advance these data science environments across the three campuses. And so anyway, I have counterpart ethnographers across these campuses that are looking at reproducibility as well. These are two graduate students that I work with at University of Washington, Anissa Tanweer and Meg Druid. They're wonderful. And we study data science practice and data science culture, and we take kind of a applied bent to our research. So we work, we want sort of to develop have sort of a joint knowledge production, and also develop things that are relevant and useful to the communities that we're studying. So I'm going to talk about how we study and approach the reproducibility in data science, and some of the emerging questions and themes that come from that. And then I'm going to try to organize that in a competing values sort of working model, and leave you with some concluding thoughts. This is posted right across from my desk on the wall at the eScience Institutes from where I sit. And since not everyone's laughing, I think I need to explain what GET is. So as an ethnographer, I take these kinds of artifacts seriously, because I think that they say something about the culture that, even if they're in jest, they say something about the culture that I'm immersed in. And GET is a version control software that is considered to be one of the foundational kinds of building blocks in doing reproducible computational work. And so this is sort of what the people that I study and work with live and breathe. And this is also what they evangelize, to others. This is sort of what they teach as the first thing they teach about reproducibility is often this. Not the fire thing, but GET. So, so I look at reproducibility discourse. Reproducibility is a core issue across the communities I'm studying. So data science has sort of taken it, at least in academia, has taken it up as part of this a movement. And we have a reproducibility and open science working group that works across the three institutions. And they are contemplating questions like, what does reproducibility look like in this increasingly data-intensive, computational, decentralized kind of new knowledge-making environment, as we just heard about. And Victoria Stodden has talked about how computers are not only the platform for method implementation, but also acting as scientific instruments. And that presents new challenges and new opportunities to an age-old problem of reproducibility in science. And so this group really has brought the sort of idea that there's this opportunity there, has brought into particular focus something they call sort of computational reproducibility. And the definition is here. It's where a second investigator, including you in the future, can recreate the final reported results, given only a set of files and written instructions. And so they've kind of coalesced around this definition. And so there's this idea that with this computational reproducibility, it does something to scope the problem, and it not only kind of reflects the changing face of the problem, but it also perhaps makes it appear a little more tractable, and that we sort of have an opportunity for greater control. So that is accompanied by a flurry of technical kind of solutions to reproducibility, and these are sort of almost like badges, right? So adopting and using these different different tools and techniques can be likened to sort of adopting a code of honor, or sort of signaling to others that you are a scientist that is part of this kind of the subculture that and you're included in that. Reproducibility in practice. So we've done over 50 interviews with researchers engaging in data science practice, 2 years of participant observation, thinking about data science collaborations and how they negotiate issues of reproducibility. What's come out of that is many things, but one insight is that when you ask people about reproducibility, or there are conversations about reproducibility, just like the one, of course, we're having here, they always go to these kinds of these sort of larger value-laden kinds of conversations around the institutional and social kind of milieu that people are dealing with, and so these sort of multiple values and how they're sort of competing in different circumstances and in collaborations and at different scales. And so I tried to sort of, this is the norm, not the exception. People are always juggling these competing values. That's what it means to be an academic. But to organize these thoughts, I've adapted the competing values, a model that Quinn and Rohrbach used to think about organizational effectiveness and organizational change, to think about some of the challenges that are articulated in these conversations about reproducibility. So on the horizontal axis, you have the focus of the organizational, or sort of at an individual level, organizational level, or think about at a lab level, whether you're sort of on one end internally focused, so really focused on the maintenance of the socio-technical system, so the human resources, the technical resources that are going to enable you to do your work, versus the sort of externally focused, versus the competitive positioning. And then you have the vertical axis is about organizational structure. So whether you're structured more towards a flexible structure, highly adaptive to change, or you're, and maybe that's accompanied with higher risk activities, or you're focused really, or you're structured more towards stability and control. And so in these quadrants, you can see that. Actually, I should just say that this should probably be ringing true from like what other people have said on all the panels. And so clearly the critique of sort of the current situation is that we're sort of over-focused on these sort of competitive positioning, external focus, and maybe that's causing sort of underdevelopment of some of these other internal focus and maintenance kind of questions. And that work is sort of, the short-term work of reproducibility, mentorship, things like that. So the first quadrant can looks like the value. So if you're sort of focused on internally and have a sort of stable structure, you're really valuing quality control. And in one participant's words, it was sort of getting it right, literally. That is the highest value that you're holding. And advocates talk about that as sort of replicability or reproducibility, depending on what community you're in. But this idea, and this is mostly, I think, what we've been talking about today, this quadrant. We've been sort of in this quadrant. As one of our senior data scientists said, about the meticulous documentation work that he does, and all the kinds of, he's documented the things that don't work and the things that do work, and so he is like a star reproducible scientist, and he says it really works as a signal of integrity for him. So if you doubt me, here it is, all of it, go and check me. And then he followed up and said, I don't think anyone actually has gone and checked me, or that anyone would necessarily, but still it matters that they could. This quadrant is sort of still internally focused, but now you're sort of structured towards flexibility and change and highly adaptive. So you're concerned about sustainability. This is like, you want to develop things that are going to last, whether that's skills, researchers, whether that's thinking about lab infrastructure, software packages, et cetera. And advocates tend to think about this, I think, and talk about this as reusability. So how reusable is your code? And this is often expressed as sort of this frustration of the reinvention of the wheel problem, and the kind of, yeah, they put their code up there, and they documented it sort of, except for I can't figure out how to use it, so it's kind of useless to me. So the next quadrant is you're sort of structured towards change, but you're oriented more competitively, and this values that sort of innovation. People talked about doing something new, doing research that was novel, and then, or actually also connecting to collaborations that were new and novel as well. So. And this, I think, kind of maps to the discourse around extensibility that advocates talk about, which is, that someone can extend based on your work and sort of use that, and it could be yourself that extends on it at a later point, but that it is fodder for innovation. And this last one we're all very familiar with. So you're sort of oriented towards a stable structure and sort of incremental kind of work, but you're also very competitively positioned. So this is more about productivity and people talking about producing things that actually have an external valuation that counts, like publications and grants and gaming the proxy indicators, et cetera. And this is kind of an interesting thing, because lately the advocates on the reproducibility and open science community have been talking a lot about framing reproducibility to communities around this value of citability. So, if you open your data, you can write a data paper and get it published in a journal, and so you could actually get credit for doing this kind of reproducible work. Or there are various kind of badge systems that create alternative metrics for making your work reproducible at different levels. And so this is sort of in that vein what the response of advocates. And so most of the time people talked about balancing work across these values. So it was never just sort of one, it was always in relation. So it wasn't that they didn't value reproducibility, any of these per se, but it was sort of in relation to these other values. They were, and they're also, this is not to say that there weren't instances where there were activities that obviously supported, multiple values, but there were also a lot of times where people very reflexively talked about, choosing one over the other, and reflexively understanding the consequences of that. So at different points in their career, for instance, or in different situations. I don't have time to go through any of the actual ethnographic work, but I will start with end with concluding thoughts. So I've given you just a little window into the competing values that people and organizations and labs are negotiating their work around reproducibility, and then also how the discourse of advocates of reproducibility has different strands of and maps to different values across the community. And I think it's really important that we think about the different collaborations and disciplinary contexts in which people work as part of thinking about how to work reproducibility. And even as many of these tools that are coming out for reproducibility, they sort of appear to be general purpose tools. I love this. One of the participants that I work with, he often is teaching people how to adopt Git. And he often warns them, this is not a technical solution. This is a social technology. It's fundamentally, he's referring to, the way that this technology actually supports the sort of collaborative and communicative work with yourself or with your lab, over time. And so it actually has to be adapted to the culture of your lab and to how you actually work. And so it's sort of, these challenges are intertwined with how people communicate and collaborate. Culture. I think there's something here about sort of in this culture, the adoption of tools and practices for computational reproducibility. It does more than, quote, make the work reproducible. It's actually really culturally significant. So in Bourdieu's terms, it has symbolic capital. It performs membership and position within a subculture, and that has particular notions of what's honorable and what's shameful. And I think we can all, I think that discourse of what's honorable and what's shameful is common and present in these circles if you've spent any time with them. So that's kind of interesting. And this is also sort of seen in the badge systems, or how people discuss their sort of strategic choice of tools. This is a discourse around computational hygiene and tidiness. So how much mess in your work is too much mess, and in what context is sort of another question. But it points to these being sort of culturally significant, how it is you engage with these tools and practices. And then communication, my home discipline, very important. So I think that considering these kind of competing values in the context of reproducibility helps us understand how the work of communication is actually valued in science more generally. So the questions of communication of what gets communicated, for whom does it get communicated, and how the work gets communicated are really important questions that we need to ask, and I think everyone's sort of been touching on these issues. For instance, in the academic system, we value the communication of results over process or null findings, et cetera, that kind of thing. I mean, that kind of what gets communicated is a good place to start asking those questions. And then I think that hopefully maybe thinking through some of these competing values might be useful in communicating, to figure out how to kind of communicate to different groups, since there is such a diversity of different kinds of roles and positions and relationships across the university. And maybe it helps funders and institutions and organizations look at the broader ecosystem and figure out how to better direct their efforts in different contexts and inspire new ways of valuing this work. Thank you.